In case you haven't realized it yet, I listen to a lot of video game soundtracks. In fact, there was a several-year span when I was barely playing any games at all and only buying OSTs or games that I wanted to record the music from. It all started in high school when I realized I could plug the TV into a cassette recorder with the headphone jack and record the music that I liked onto tapes. Not very conducive to getting girlfriends, in case you couldn't guess. Anyways, I made a ton of them, and I actually still have one or two of them just for nostalgic purposes. Now that I live in Japan, I have access to all the great game music CDs. Or at least the ones I can afford. It was a pretty niche market, and they weren't pressed in big numbers, so now a ton of them are just crazy expensive. So much so that $100 doesn't even make me flinch anymore. While a ton of games got CD releases, including some really obscure ones, there are still plenty of games with great music that never had an official CD. So in today's episode, I'm going to introduce the 10 greatest game soundtracks that never had a commercial OST. Games that had digital-only releases are still eligible, as well as games that may have had an unofficial vinyl release. So let's get into it. In no particular order, we are starting with Dragon Drive for the Gamecube. Dragon Drive was a 3D shooting game adaptation from a comic series by none other than Treasure. The game itself certainly isn't extraordinary, but this was the last soundtrack done by Toshiya Yamanaka, who wrote the music for games like Star Cruiser and Sin and Punishment. Much like Sin and Punishment, the music is very jazz and progressive rock inspired, with crazy keyboard and guitar solos in most songs. I can only pray that some game company is smart enough to pick up Mr. Yamanaka and get him to do another soundtrack someday. Next up is the elusive Air Gallet. Or is that pronounced Air Galley? It's an arcade shooting game made by ex-members of Toaplan, and for the music they brought in Yoshitatsu Sakai, who was also the composer for Toaplan's very last game, Batsugun. The songs are basically synth rock, very much like Batsugun, and that's a good thing. The sound driver in the game is also very orally satisfying. It has that thick synth sound with crunchy percussion, which was so exemplary of arcade music in the early 90s. It isn't a long soundtrack, but every song is inspirational. This one stays in my iPhone. Now for something from the PC Engine, Crossweaver. No one's really sure what Weaver is supposed to refer to, and it doesn't matter. The game is awful, but the music is pure genius. The tracks have a techy, futuristic sound, which matches the setting of the game well. Crossweaver was made by Face, whose other games like Honey in the Sky and Alice in Wonder Dream I had really enjoyed, which is why I tried it in the first place. It's a shame they gave so little thought to the gameplay in this one, but it definitely has one of the best soundtracks of any HU card. This one is a no-brainer to anyone acquainted with the game. Slot number 4 goes to Battlemania Daiginjo for the Sega Mega Drive. The first Battlemania was released in the West as Troubleshooter, but Daiginjo stayed in Japan. The first game had very good music too, but the sounds weren't developed well and the percussion was way too loud. The sequel fixes this and has some of the cleanest electric guitar sounds anyone ever got out of the Mega Drive. All the tracks are super high powered and make you want to run down the street at full speed. As I've mentioned in other videos, Battlemania Daiginjo is much too easy to be called a great shooter, and it's also one of the most expensive games on the system, but the music is top notch. I'm also giving one spot to a PS1 game, Zanac Neo. This was Compile's last shooter, and the amount of love they gave it makes it seem like they knew it would be the last. A few of the tracks were done by Katsumi Tanaka, but most of them were by the relatively new Ko Hayashi and Daisuke Nagata, who went on to build a cult-like following for their music for Milestones games like Chaos Field and Karos. They even had their own unit name, KHDN, derived from the initials of their names. Their music experiments with many subgenres of techno, which could easily be drowned in an ocean of similar music if it weren't so original. You can very clearly hear their style coming into its own in the tracks of Zanac Neo. For number 6, the PC Engine delivers once again with the soundtrack to Air Zonk. Air Zonk was a spin-off of the Bonk games, putting a roboticized version of him into a horizontal shooter. The artwork is totally nuts, with crazy transformations where your character combines with the helper into some impossible super machine, like a fire-breathing bulldozer or a thing where you shoot milk bottles from your boobs. Cool! Thankfully, the graphics aren't used to cover up poor gameplay. Zonk is an excellent shooter, and the sound driver is one of the best on the system. Only the Soldier games sound as good. Next is the Sega Genesis cartridge version of Deace. And I'm saying Sega Genesis for a reason. There was no cartridge version in Japan. It was only released on CD here. Deace is a horizontal shooter by Wolf Team, and as usual the soundtrack is magnificent work by Motoi Sakuraba, who is now famous for his work on the Tales and Star Ocean series. Deace was originally called Feast and started out on the X68000 computer like most of the other Wolf Team ports for the Mega Drive. But while Final Zone, Granada, and even Zon had OSTs, Feast somehow managed to get passed over. Which is a real shame, because every track is a masterpiece. The music was finally made available digitally from Egg Music, but if you want to listen to it through a CD player, you'll have to burn a disc yourself. There's no way I could finish this list without Soldier Blade, again for the PC Engine. Soldier Blade was part of the Star Soldier series, which most people consider to have peaked on the PC Engine or Turbografx 16. There were 3 games for the system: Super Star Soldier, Soldier Blade, and Final Soldier. But while the first and last game managed to get OST releases, Soldier Blade was passed over. Which is confusing, because as good as the music is in the other 2 games, Soldier Blade is arguably the best. It's also the most expensive game in the series, which indicates that most players probably consider it to be the best entry. Now that we're getting close to the end, I'll reveal the most obvious game on this list. It's Lords of Thunder, for the Turbografx CD. The original Japanese title was Winds of Thunder, and the music is just as badass as the name indicates. This is Japanese hard rock at its best, and if you didn't know better, you might even think it was a real band recorded on cheap equipment. The game has nearly an hour of music on it, and every song has a ton of intricate guitar work. It truly is one of the greatest game soundtracks of all time, despite being on a console that wasn't nearly as popular as Nintendo or Sega's hardware, at least in the West. There was also a North American exclusive Sega CD version with slightly altered songs. Opinions are split on which is better, although most people would concur the percussion on the Sega CD version is stronger. If by some chance you've never heard these songs, go listen to them now. My followers probably realize at this point that my final choice is going to be out in left field. Any guesses? The last game on this list is the legendary God Panic for the PC Engine CD. If your first reaction is, what the hell is God Panic? You've come to the right place. God Panic is a silly, nonsensical vertical shooter by Teichiku, who gave us other masterpieces like Acrobat Mission on the Super Famicom. That's sarcasm, by the way. Acrobat Mission is bad. You play as some guy in a cat suit, and any more attempt to explain what's going on will just result in more confusion. It's not a horrible shooter, not great either, but the music was given an outrageous amount of attention and love. The game loops twice, and the second loop has you taking on Hell, which is really the same game but just reskinned a little bit. But the music is completely different and gets really dark and experimental. It's one of the most unlikely places to find such a magnificent soundtrack, and of course, there was no OST. God Panic is one of the reasons why searching for obscure Japanese games is so rewarding. When I was planning this episode, I originally wanted to make it about the top 5 greatest game soundtracks with and without OSTs, but I quickly realized there's no way I could narrow down either of those categories to just 5 games. Even 10 was tough. So in the future there could be a sequel about the top 10 greatest official game soundtrack CDs of all time. For now, this is the end of today's episode. If you have any other game soundtracks that you really enjoy, please do tell me about them in the comments. And I'll see you next time.